There are 8 different layers when you're tokenizing a real-world asset that you have to be very mindful and pay attention to. Especially in the world of regulation, where doing it wrong can be extremely costly. I'm going to cover all of them in this video. For example, the first one, legal wrapper. Do you have a way to legally hold your asset? Compliance. Do you actually make sure that people who hold that are legally compliant and able to do so? Issuance. Who's issuing your tokens? How do you issue your tokens? When do you issue your tokens? The custody. How do you handle that? Who holds that? Who holds the assets? Who holds the keys, right? That's really important. Would you want someone holding the keys? That's unethical? Probably not. So that's really important. It's a weak link in the chain, essentially. The Oracle and valuation, we've seen a lot of failures in regards to this, right? If we're not mindful of that, it can really kill the whole system. If we have a bad price, people can arbitrage against that and take advantage very quickly. We've seen that happen. The distribution, how are you distributing your token? How are you enabling people to acquire the token in a compliant manner, especially? Liquidity, do you have liquidity? This is a big thing in the market is it's easy to tokenize something. It's another thing to build a market around it, and liquidity is essential for that. And the last thing is the composability, right? If you have liquidity, you have these tokens, but they can't go into different systems and tools effectively, and there's too much friction. Well, that's going to affect the usefulness of those assets. But if you built a way that it could compliantly move throughout different systems and tools, now you increase the usefulness of those assets in different ways. That's really what we're going to be covering the whole video. First one I want to talk about, though, is the legal wrapper, right? So if you don't start with the legal wrapper, you're not starting in the right frame. Think about it. If you were to sell somebody a token and said, hey, this really represents gold, and it said, show me how, and you can't do that, then you cannot claim the token actually represents real gold and links to real gold, unless you can show how that happens in a legally compliant manner, right? So for example, you have the asset, it might be held in an SPV or trust, depending on where you're domiciled. That then is split into the token, and it's held by the investor. But let's keep in mind, that investor wants to know that what they're holding legally represents the correct asset. For example, let's say you bought somebody's house that was a tokenized asset and you bought a portion of those. Then later on you found out, well, you know what? Sorry guys, the company went out of business. All those tokens are useless. Well, wait a minute. What happened when that company went out of business? Who holds the real estate tokens and assets today? Oh, we do. We hold those. That's us. Your tokens are gone. You went out of business, right? So when you think about what can actually happen in this new way of doing things, it can actually be destructive. It can be destructive. It can harm the market. These new way of doing things that we want to benefit the market can actually cause destruction if they're not put together in the right way. In addition to that, if we don't build something in a legally compliant manner and start thinking about this, that will erode the trust, right? So the more, let's say somebody new comes into this space and they're interested in getting into a real-world asset, and they find out they bought something, and a couple months later they find out it's not real, it's fake, it's funny money. How does that person then see the next project that tries to do this or company that tries to do the same thing in the market, only in a compliant manner? They've just eroded the trust of that other company trying to do it legally. And this is the biggest problem when it comes to compliance, isn't just the fact that you might be doing it wrong, it's the fact that you kill it for all the other people that are doing it right. It creates a bad taste in people's mouths. That can create a lot of problems. Now, the next one I want to talk about is compliance especially, right? So let's say, for example, in the US here, I'm not able to sell a house to someone, that let's say is in India, let's say as an example. Let's say that's illegal here in the US. Well, I can't just magically start forming tokens around it and doing that. I need to make sure that when I'm selling a person in India, they're legally compliant and able to hold that. And they should make sure that in their country, and our platform should do that for them, that in their country, they're also legally compliant, able to do that, right? So when you think about, for example, a token standard, like an ERC 3643 that has something called an on-chain ID, what is that really doing? It's saying, well, anybody, can actually do a KYC and have an on-chain ID, and we don't need to know their personal identifiable information through zero knowledge, right? We can just say that, hey, if your wallet has identified and it's proven compliant, we don't need to know who you are, but on-chain proven compliant, now you're able to hold the token and just enables that transfer to happen, right? So we're talking about compliance. It's also important because it enables the efficiencies, right? We don't have to check all this stuff. We don't have to trust all this stuff. It's trustless. So-and-so's wallet has already become compliant. Tony has become compliant. The person in India is compliant. Why do we need to get involved in that? Why do we need paperwork? Why do we need anything else other than to enable the token to transfer the value to transfer? Anything else that gets involved in that is waste in the actual process, right? Because the value is moving tokens from one wallet to the other in that transaction. Now, if we think about it in a traditional world, all that stuff happens offline. All that stuff happens with paperwork. All that stuff happens in a more expensive manner. So when we start looking at tokenization and what's really helping, it's not just the fact that now we can check the compliance on chain, but it's also the fact that we can create all these automations and stuff. And we can also make sure that, hey, for example, if your wallet is in this jurisdiction, only then can you hold this asset. We can do that on chain. And that's the world that we're coming into. We're getting rid of all the paperwork and all the people and all the stuff that's actually not creating any value in that transaction. That's going away. And that's really why compliance is so important, is it's a weak link in the chain if you don't get it right, and it can actually crater and crush the entire business, right? You can have lawsuits. You can literally take the whole company's treasury down. So that's why compliance is especially an important thing to keep in mind. Now, when we get to the issuance side, let's just talk about this. Let's say, for example, I go to my neighbor's house, I tokenize everything, and I start selling all of them. Well, wait a minute. Who's actually issuing these tokens? Where are they coming from? Are they able to do that? Is it done in a compliant way? And that's why these platforms, for example, Securitize and Tokeny are becoming so important, right? So, when you go on these platforms that they've done their vetting, they've done their homework, they're bringing on real businesses, they have these real tokens, real assets, they got the KYC built in, they got all the security and compliance built in. They might even check the wallets for anti-money laundering, which is really important. Okay, so you start looking at what's happening here, this is what we're talking about, right? Now when we think about issuance, those platforms then will ensure that stakeholders within the given ecosystem, for example, you have a team that has an employee that's able to issue tokens. That should be done on a platform that's compliant, that can be tracked every step of the way. Once you start disrupting that compliance and disrupting the issuance process, now you create an issue with a lack of trust, right? So when I look at this, right here we see the legal entity. It's a record of who owns what. We have the issuance platform, and it mints against that record. Let's take this in the standpoint of a real-world asset like tokenized gold, right? We have the gold that's inside the warehouse, and we might have a reserve of that's there, right? So if we have, let's say, $1 million worth of gold that's inside the warehouse, we might only tokenize a portion of that, let's say $800,000 worth. We have $200,000 that's sitting there that's not tokenized. We have $800,000 that is tokenized, right? So that we can issue those tokens, assuming we do so in a compliant manner. Now, it's not like, let's say, for example, we can issue $1.5 million worth of tokens. We don't have that much gold. So if we issued beyond what we hold, that would be an issue. Pun intended with issuance. If we did that, that would be an issue with issuance. And that's why we need to make sure, again, we have the right platforms, we have the right wallets that are correctly labeled, that are transferring tokens, smart contracts. Even if you don't use a platform, for example, like a Securitize or Tokeny, you still need to make sure that it's done so in a compliant and in a transparent way. And that's really what we're talking about on the issuance side. On the custody side, when we're talking about custody, we're talking about who can hold the asset and who can move the token, right? So we're talking about how that works. So if we look at, a real asset, it might be held by a bank or a vault. Like I just mentioned, like for example, if we talk about real world assets and tokenized gold, that might be inside of a vault. Unless, for example, you're planning on all your people that buy the tokens to have all that shipped out to their house. That'd be expensive, cost prohibitive, high overhead. Why would we do that? Why not have a token that just moves around, right? So that's what we're talking about with these tokenized assets, as well as the custody and how we're able to manage all of that. Or also you have the token that's moved by whoever holds, and it's assigning keys, right? So we can manage that through Fireblocks and Anchorage. Again, you can make sure that the custody is being maintained, right? You don't have to trust the custody. You can often see even audited reports. And that's a big thing that I believe we'll see in the future as well is, man, wouldn't it be cool to see that your asset here is actually an on-chain audited report? Sounds like, hey, that's too pie in the sky in the future. Well, it's not actually. The Dubai Land Department actually has that right now. You can go on there and you can actually go on PRYPCO and you can invest and you can see how many tokens you have on chain. You can actually see all that. Unfortunately, they're using Ripple. Anyway, you can go on XRP and you can see on Ripple the actual ledger and see who holds what tokens, the wallets, and it's linked exactly to the decimals on chain. It's completely done in a legally compliant manner. So when we talk about custody, that's what we're talking about, right? Where those things are actually held, how that works, how that actually operates. So in the example of Dubai Land Department, we know that when we're buying a property on PRYPCO, granted it has problems with exit liquidity, so people can't sell their tokens. However, we know when we're buying that, we're buying a real home or a fraction of a real home, right, in that case. Now, let's talk about Oracle valuations, and this is often a very big weak link in the chain, right? So the Oracle has to tie in this external data from the real world into what we have right here, right? So we have this Oracle data that's coming in, and this Oracle data needs to be accurate. It needs to be trusted. So let's say, for example, we have an oracle that's pulling data from the outside world that connects to our gold price. And the oracle starts to have, and we also have a lending and borrowing against our gold. Right now we start to have a problem where the gold tokens actually start to gain a ton of value. Right? Gain a ton of value if the oracle screwed up, right? So I've seen this on CoinMarketCap, where I was a trillionaire in the tokens I held because all the tokens connect in your wallet connected the price feeds off of CoinMarketCap. So when CoinMarketCap screwed up, because the price feeds were off and it was tied in, all the prices and all the portfolios and the tokens were way off. All right, so we think about this in the same context. These unreported values need to tie into lending and borrowing, redemption, collateral reporting. All these things need to be the same. But in that example I gave, let's say we have that gold price of that token is wrong. And that was the collateral, right? So before I had $1,000 in gold I could borrow against, now I have $5,000. Wow, the moment that happens in the system, I have $5,000 I can borrow against. Now I, as a borrower, take advantage of that. I take $4,000 more out of the system in USDC and I take that. Now let's say the oracle fixes itself, the price goes back down to 1,000. I've just robbed the system of collateral with my collateral. That was really funny money at the time. I took advantage of that oracle price. And that's what we're talking about when hackers exploit these oracle price differences. And really, it's not even an exploit, really. It's actually looking at an advantage in some cases. Those oracles are a weak point of failure. So how do you have redundancy against that? How do you have circuit breakers against that? So for example, do you expect the price of gold to crash 95% in a day, or could that be an outlier result that kicks a circuit breaker and stops the system before someone might take advantage of that? So when you look at the oracles, that's going to become a major issue for us as we build, is those things need to be really dialed in and correct and creating the correct values. Now, another thing I want to talk about is distribution. This is where so many people go wrong in the real world assets, is they just think about their thing. Oh, I'm going to tokenize these assets. It's a better product. People will buy it. That's not true. There's a lot of great inventors out there that are actually broke, that have made phenomenal investments, that don't know how to market it and get distribution. So they end up broke, right? So if you want to think about this, let's say, for example, here in the US, baseball is a very popular sport. Now you go outside the baseball game and let's say there aren't, the best food out there. They're just selling the hot dogs and they're expensive and they're cheap hot dogs. They don't taste the best. But people are coming out of the baseball game and they are starving. And they're just going to be buying those things like crazy. Doesn't matter. Because that people right there, those people with the hot dog carts control the distribution channel. They're right there outside the baseball game. They're monetizing off that. So if you think about your tokens, and if you think about your distribution channels, how are you going to distribute your tokens to a market that wants them, that might even traditionally buy them now, or that might expand into a different market? Okay, so for example, Franklin Templeton, why did they come up with the Benji? That's not because it was something for their existing investors. It's something that attracts a new type of investor that wants a digital asset called a Benji, right? So you start thinking about what they're actually doing. This is what we're talking about, is the distribution, the marketing layer. And so that's why that's what all the biggest firms are getting right now, is that piece of the puzzle. Okay, so if we think about this distribution, you got the marketplace and the investor. You got the broker-dealer and the investor. You got the permission tool in the investor, right? So when you look at all this stuff, you're going to have multiple different ways that you'll be able to route the distribution. Even if you think about tokenizing your assets and enabling others to distribute that for you, that's really intelligent. So why does Microsoft Teams have all these users? It's not because Teams is the best. It's because you already have your Microsoft account. Teams comes free with it, so all the corporates use that instead of buying all the individual Zoom accounts, right? So or Google is another example on why Google is used. However, corporate loves Microsoft, so you're going to find a lot of Teams using that. Teams is absolute garbage. Why do people use it? Because the distribution channel. It is absolute trash. Say it again, Teams sucks. This is why, but think about it. That's why Teams is everywhere. They own the distribution channel. It doesn't have to be the best product. Let's go to the next one, liquidity. So if we have liquidity here, or lack thereof, this is what's going to make or break the entire system in a big way, right? So start thinking about a holder that wants out. Can they actually get out? So here's what I want you to do right now. Go on Google reviews and search for PRYPCO, PRYPCO, and read the Google reviews of what people will say. What you'll find is people go onto PRYPCO and think they're buying, and they actually are. They're buying a token that connects their actual rented property. They're buying that. However, PRYPCO only has sale windows 2 times a year, I believe it is. So for example, let's say you bought all your tokens, and now the window opens up. Well, everyone is in the same window trying to sell at the same time. And how do you sell your tokens? right? So go in there and read the Google reviews. A lot of people will be complaining. Why? Because they can't get out, because there's no exit liquidity. There's no people that want to buy in, right? So the secondary market isn't there. The investor isn't there. So when you start thinking about the liquidity and how to be able to transfer tokens and actually good value for your assets and actually monetize those assets, this is a massive piece of it. So do you have a secondary market for these tokens and assets? Or if not, do you have an OTC desk that maybe enables you to transfer those even more efficiently on the market versus worrying about liquidity pools and slippage and that type of a thing, right? So do you have an OTC desk that helps you do that? Or do you have a way for people to just literally redeem? Like if you think about like tokenized metals, PAX Gold, you can go in there if you got enough PAX Gold, you can redeem your gold and they will ship it right out to your house. You can redeem it. So that's real liquidity that comes in and out. Now think about it. So Tony wanted his gold shipped out to him. They took that and they shipped it back to him. That's all liquidity. That's all value. That's monetization of the product and the tokens. PAX Gold makes money off that. Tether makes money off of that transaction right there. They're making profit off of that. So this is what we're talking about. If we're going to build a real business, we need to think about liquidity. We need to think about the volume of this. We need to think about making actual money off of this. And this is why it's so important. And the last piece here is really composability. Right? So if we think about the assets that we have, especially in the context of distribution, if we want to maximize all the different protocols that can use our assets, and it makes sense. For example, I have a tokenized property I put into a lending borrowing pool, and I borrow against that asset. And people on the platform trust that token, trust that asset, because it's from a validated platform that's trusted, right? So you trust that. And now I'm borrowing against that. Now let's say a big bill came up in my life. Okay, and I had a major bill come up, and I hold these property tokens. And now here's the thing. Now let's say it's $5,000, and I don't have the money in my savings account, but I have property tokens that are $10,000. Here's what I can do. Instead of eating a $5,000 20 to 30% APY on credit card, I take my $10,000 of tokens of property I already have, I lock that in a protocol, I borrow $5,000 right away, and I pay the debt off. And now I cover whatever the interest rate is on that platform, which is probably hardly anything in comparison to the credit card debt. Now think about it. This is why the banks don't want people to be able to do this, is now you can borrow against those assets. And now let's say you don't pay that back. Well, those people got your property tokens. They got that. Or let's say you really can't make any more and you really have to pay that off. You sell part of your property tokens to somebody else because there's liquidity, and then you make that back. Then you pay off your debts, right? So when you think about composability, this is what I'm talking about. The ability of the tokens to go through all these different systems, to find different use cases, that will increase the value of the token, right? So if something, for example, a property token has a variety of different use cases and value behind it, I expect that to become more valuable than a property that cannot do that, right? So if I got a token that connects to a property that's composable, that lets me use it in a variety of ways, that token is more useful. That property is more useful. Right now, the property just collects rent in the current state. In a future product, that property token might let me borrow against something, pay off a debt, let other people buy it from me easier. That value of that token is significantly higher because of that liquidity, because of the value it drives beyond just the asset that I hold. And so this is what we're talking about when we come into composability, is the ability to use assets in a variety of different ways beyond ways that we're able to now. And this is what we're talking about, the power of composability alongside all these real world assets. We think about all of them together, right? So we do all that, think about all that together. This is really what we're talking about, is we're going to cover all these and touch all these really important components along the way, but that's going to set us up in a way that lets people trust what we're doing is actually true and real. Actually, you won't have to trust because it'll be on chain. And once you think about all the liquidity that's coming on chain, stable coins, everything else, because that's the most efficient way to transfer money. Now we got pools of money. Now we got pools of tokens. Now we got composability and legal and compliance. We've got on-chain markets. That's going to be huge. And this is why at tokenomics.net, we're significantly invested in the future outcome of this potential.